It was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, and nearly every day, prisoners were brought in. However, no one ever saw them leave. That's because no one ever survived this facility. We only know what happened because some of those involved could not live with their guilt and came forward. But death was not the horrifying part. It was a relief. Wait until you see what one human can do to another. Far from the eyes of the world, the Japanese Imperial Army was constructing a massive, secretive facility. In reality, it was Unit 731, a code name that would come to symbolize one of the darkest chapters in human history. Orchestrated by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, this was no ordinary military base. Unit 731 was a laboratory of horrors, dedicated to the most heinous biological and chemical experiments imaginable. The end goal was not just scientific discovery. It was to create weapons of biological warfare to give Japan the upper hand in military pursuits. The facility was disguised as a lumber mill, but there were no trees being cut there. Twice a week, black smoke would billow from chimneys, and for some reason, prisoners were referred to as logs, if you know what I mean. For years, until the end of World War II, Unit 731 operated in the shadows, with its deeds too gruesome for daylight. While the war ended, the disturbing history of this place would haunt humanity for years to come. Stick around. It's a story I guarantee you won't forget. Imagine you're a brilliant young scientist during World War II, and you receive a letter from the government saying you've been chosen for a top-secret project that could change the course of the war. It sounds like an adventure out of a movie. But, as you're about to find out, sometimes real life is darker than fiction. Hiroshi, an actual scientist who joined Unit 731 in 1941, receives this letter inviting him to contribute to a top-secret project aimed at protecting Japan. Feeling a sense of patriotic duty, Hiroshi packs his bags and heads to northeastern China. When Hiroshi arrives, he's shocked by the sheer size of the Unit 731 complex. This is not some makeshift camp. It's a state-of-the-art facility. On the first day, he's given a tour, and everything seems legitimate. Then Hiroshi is taken to another section of the complex, and that's when he sees them. Human beings in cages. These prisoners are the unwilling subjects of experiments. The officials say, "This is war, and sacrifices must be made for the greater good." They're just captured Chinese or Russians, races inferior to the Japanese, right? Hiroshi is uneasy, but what can he do? He's in too deep now, and he knows the fate that awaits him if he rebels. Now, I need to warn you, this part gets very graphic, but to honor the victims and prevent such horrors from recurring, we must face the uncomfortable truth. So, what happened inside those walls? What unimaginable suffering did the prisoners undergo? Hiroshi's first task is to observe a live vivisection, surgery on a living human being without anesthesia. They tell him it's to study how diseases spread in the human body. The prisoner understood his fate and did not resist when he was taken into the room and restrained. However, the screaming began when the surgeon picked up the scalpel, producing horrifying, unimaginable sounds until it finally ceased. This type of procedure was a routine part of the surgeon's day, and such practices were common among Japanese doctors in China during that time. There are reports that even members of Unit 731 who became infected by diseases from the prisoners underwent live vivisections. As he takes notes, he does his best not to look into the eyes of the man on the table, whose body is trembling from unbearable pain as his organs are removed while he's still alive. If you think that's the darkest part of this story, hold on, because it gets worse. Unit 731 is not just about experiments. It's also a biological warfare factory. Hiroshi learns they're using infected fleas and dropping them over Chinese villages. Reports come in saying the death toll is in the thousands. He's trapped in a cycle of justification, telling himself he's just following orders. One day, Hiroshi is assigned to a frostbite experiment. Prisoners are left out in the cold or placed in specially made machines until their limbs freeze. They're then brought in, and their flesh is thawed to study the effects. The screams are haunting. Hiroshi knows he's crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Then there are the pressure chamber tests. Prisoners are placed inside chambers and subjected to varying atmospheric pressures to determine the breaking point of the human body. The results are as excruciating as you can imagine, often leading to death. Don't forget the lethal injections. Subjects are deliberately injected with diseases like typhoid and cholera. to see how fast these diseases will ravage the human body. Afterward, the victims are dissected alive, without anesthesia, to document the progression of the disease. And as if that weren't enough, some prisoners are subjected to live amputations. Their limbs are removed, not for any medical reason, but to study blood loss. Sometimes, these severed limbs are even reattached to opposite sides of the body in a sickening mockery of medical science. Not to mention that there were women, children, and even pregnant women. And the things done to them are too terrible to mention in this narrative. Experiments with toxic gases, biological weapons, testing grenades, bullets, shrapnel, and bayonets were conducted on live humans because it's the best way to see how they work, right? Some of the experiments conducted by Unit 731 were not intended to improve germ warfare or medical knowledge. They were done out of professional curiosity, essentially asking, what would happen if we did this? For example, there was no medical reason to perform and study beheadings. That was purely for experimentation. In other experiments, subjects were subjected to extreme conditions to see how long they could survive. They were starved and deprived of water or hung upside down until they died. Others were placed in centrifuges and spun to death, injected with animal blood, such as horse blood, or exposed to deadly levels of X-rays. They were also subjected to chemical weapons in gas chambers, injected with seawater, and in some cases, burned or buried alive. The level of cruelty concentrated in one place is difficult to comprehend, yet it still occurred. Finally, the war comes to an end. Hiroshi goes back home, carrying the dark secret of Unit 731 with him. But the worst part? Many of those responsible were never brought to justice. The American government grants many Unit 731 scientists immunity in exchange for the data they collected. Hiroshi tries to move on, but the faces of those he experimented on haunt him for the rest of his life. Although the Chinese government had lodged accusations against Japan for using plague as a weapon during the war, these claims were largely ignored by the international community at the time. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the United States became interested in the data collected by Unit 731, leading to a secretive agreement. Many of the unit's high-ranking officials, including its commander Shiro Ishii, were granted immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for sharing their research with the US. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that more detailed information began to emerge, largely due to testimonies from former members and researchers who had been involved with the unit. Public interest was ignited, leading to further investigations and eventually international recognition of the atrocities committed there. Unit 731 was dismantled, but the horror of what took place there should not be forgotten. It serves as a grim lesson about the ethical boundaries that should never be crossed, no matter the justification. Because when we forget or ignore the darkness in our past, we risk allowing it to happen again.